We've already seen how the Great Awakening led to some reforms. Let's see how those reforms progress and become even more radical. There's division in reform movements. Early on, early in the 1800s, reform was seen as something that needed to be gradual, that needed to create as little conflict and disruption to society as possible. But by the 1830s, reformers have become impatient, and some are beginning to press harder for change. For example, in the temperance movement, the temperance society was split over the issue of beer and wine. Should they try to discourage the drinking of hard alcohol, or should they try to discourage the drinking of all alcohol, including beer and wine? Also, should they put pressure on consumers to stop drinking, or should they also put pressures on producers as well to stop producing alcohol? Another reform society, the American Peace Society, some of its members were split and felt that and began to oppose even the defensive use of force and even opposed government using force to enforce the law. So we see some divisions in reform movements. But the biggest division was in the anti-slavery movement. The early anti-slavery movement was led by the organization the American Colonization Society, founded in 1817, which said that slavery is evil. But they also realized that it was an established part of the American economy and society. And the American Colonization Society realized that the elimination of slavery would need to be a gradual process and would require the cooperation of slaveholders. Which is why in 1821 the American Colonization Society established the African nation of Liberia. This is meant to serve as a destination for freed slaves. This is meant to serve as a place where freed slaves can go. That way they're not competing with Americans for jobs, they're not causing problems with people still in slavery. This is meant to try to solve some of the problems associated with ending slavery. However, very few African Americans migrate there, and almost all of the African Americans who do migrate there were already free. Barely anyone is freed from slavery so that they can go live in Liberia. And many African Americans opposed the idea of Liberia because it looked like they were giving up on the idea of racial equality. So the radical approach to anti-slavery begins in 1831 when this man, William Lloyd Garrison, launches the abolitionist movement in Boston with the publishing of his newspaper, The Liberator. In it, he calls for the immediate and total freedom and equality for slaves, and he attacks the colonization movement for not trying to do enough. Many of those colonizationalists, fed up with the slow progress, join Garrison. In 1833, he creates the American Anti-Slavery Society, which is the leading abolitionist group in America. And the Second Great Awakening, the abolitionist movement, like a lot of other reforms, is a direct byproduct of the Second Great Awakening. People felt called to do God's work, and some people saw God's work as freeing the slaves. One example of this is Theodore Dwight Weld, who heard preacher Charles Finney at a religious revival as part of the Second Great Awakening, and he himself, Weld, became an abolitionist. And he later went on to found Oberlin College, which is going to become a center of the abolitionist movement. The methods used by the abolitionists looked a lot like religious revivals. You would see preaching, you would see long week-long meetings, you would see individual proclamations of faith and service. They recruited speakers and supporters. And everywhere these meetings went, organizations formed in their wake. A lot of this is taking place in northern Ohio and western New York. That shouldn't be Kentucky. That should be western New York. The typical convert to the abolitionist movement is upper middle class in a small to medium-sized town, normally in the upper part of the North. The closer you get to the South, the more opposition to the abolitionist movement, like that poster there. And it was dangerous to be an abolitionist closer to the South. An example of this is Elijah Lovejoy, who is an abolitionist printer from Illinois, who himself is shot and killed by a pro-slavery mob that came over from Missouri. And he's one of the first martyrs of the abolitionist movement. In the cities, the abolitionist movement found strong opposition, mainly because freed blacks would take jobs from poor whites. And so there are often mobs and riots against the abolitionist movement. But it's not only poor white people in those mobs, there are middle and upper class white Americans opposed to abolitionist movement because it's seen as a threat to the social order. It's going to cause too many problems and changes in society. As an example of some of that violence towards abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison was almost lynched, almost hung by a mob in his home city of Boston. And Lewis and Arthur Tappan, who are two wealthy merchants who funded a lot of abolitionist activities, they themselves could not get very much support in New York City. There's a growing division in the abolitionist movement over what should the role of the national government be. Some see the government as corrupt. Garrison calls the Constitution a pro-slavery document. He calls for the North to secede from the Union. He publicly burns copies of the Constitution. And few people listen to these claims from him. And he really has some of his power weakened when the group splits. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Others thought that the abolitionist movement should try to use the government, which is why in 1840 we have the Liberty Party formed. This is the first abolitionist attempt to get people elected. They've gone from being an interest group to now being a political party. There's also disagreement over the role of the church. Some people feel the church haven't helped enough and they should abandon the churches. Others think they should use the church's support to help stop slavery. But the big division is over women's roles, and this is what causes that split in the abolitionist movement. In 1840, what should women's role be in the abolitionist movement? Should they be secondary or should they be allowed to lead? And the majority of people side with William Lloyd Garrison in feeling that women should be equal partners in the abolitionist movement. This springs out of an incident which occurred in 1840 at an anti-slavery convention in London, where American female abolitionists were prevented from speaking, despite the fact that they had spoken numerous times before, despite the fact that they held leadership positions in the organization. When they were denied the right to speak, some of them came back very frustrated. And eventually, two abolitionists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, organized the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, where they issued what's called the Declaration of Sentiments, where they declared that all women should be given the right to vote and should have equal legal rights. For most historians, the Seneca Falls Convention is the beginning of the women's rights movement. What about African Americans? There were black abolitionists. There were African Americans who read William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, and they started their own papers, like the Freedom Journal, founded in 1827 and actually predated Garrison's Liberator. They also wrote books like David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. Frederick Douglass is probably the most prominent black abolitionist. He's that rare, prominent African American who is an integral part of the American Anti-Slavery Society and also worked with black abolitionists. African Americans, for the most part, started their own movement against slavery, known as the Negro Convention movement, and that began in 1840. African Americans really helped the abolitionist movement by serving on the Underground Railroad, which was a secret system to try to help slaves escape from slavery. Most of the people working on the Underground Railroad, offering shelter, hiding slaves, moving them farther and farther north, most of the people working on the Underground Railroad were African Americans. The best example is Harriet Tubman, who actually went into the South and helped escort slaves to the North. In cities, African Americans and other abolitionists worked on what were called vigilance committees. And these were groups designed to help warn runaway slaves and help runaway slaves hide from slave catchers who might come into the city to retrieve the slaves.